Organization published an international standard for privacy principles, which it says were derived from existing principles developed by various states, countries, and international organizations. How far are developing countries abiding to this set of standards? While the success of achieving new and global standards for data privacy may be uncertain, this goal is definitely worth pursuing. And recently, we also have the ISO standards on privacy and in the cloud. So I think all these international standards surely would give us some idea about how to go about protection of personal information in developing countries. I would now go on to my presentation. We are living a pivotal moment for the right to privacy in developing countries and emerging democracies. With new technologies empowering people around the world and altering our relationships with governments and the corporate sector, strong legal frameworks are required to ensure that rights are adequately protected. Can I? Oh, sorry. Thank you. The complete process of negotiating privacy within this context is especially fraught in developing countries. It is here that technologies have the potential to be at their most transformative, by giving individuals the ability to access to information, express themselves, and participate in local and global discussions in unprecedented ways. However, even as new technologies and capabilities flood into developing countries, the technical knowledge necessary to design legislative frameworks remains in short supply. At the same time, international regulatory consensus has yet to emerge around issues of data protection, and regional agreements remain in flux, depriving policymakers in developing countries of strong guidance and best practice upon which to base their own regulatory frameworks. Consequently, developing countries are emerging as some of the world's worst privacy violators. Such practices persistently violate the right to privacy while also threatening the enjoyment of other human rights. The challenge is, as the right to privacy becomes more and more embattled across the developing world, there is an urgent need to educate citizens and policymakers about fortifying legal protections. Some of the world's most invasive surveillance systems are being developed in countries where individuals are most at risk. Developing countries are considered growth markets for biometric systems, health informatics, visual surveillance, and expansive communications surveillance technologies. And citizens of these countries tend to lack the legal and technical means to defend themselves. It has been argued that privacy is a Western luxury and even a potential impediment to progress. Yet, privacy is a universal human right, and our experiences in developing countries have shown us that despite cultural differences, there is a deep common interest in information privacy and personal data protection among citizens and consumers in every economy. Privacy helps create a sense of human autonomy and dignity, and is therefore in many ways synonymous with progress. Those advocating for privacy in developing countries often struggle with uninterested governments and uncomprehending courts. There is comparatively little understanding of the nuanced relationships between privacy, security, and development, or of the complex technologies involved. The default position of the authorities is often to collect as much information on as many people as possible, and human rights are rarely taken into account. Privacy is internationally recognized as a fundamental right, yet the confines of the right to privacy are subject to never-ending games of tug-of-war between individuals, governments, and corporations. These games are rarely fair. Individuals are often underinformed and lack the capacity to assert and protect their privacy, while those who seek to erode it are increasingly overbearing and secretive. This is particularly the case in developing countries, where the absence of adequate legal and institutional frameworks and safeguards facilitates unhindered corporate intrusion into privacy. Governments also collect and share excessive amounts of personal data in the name of development, security, and the modernization of public administration. In many developing countries, though constitutional provisions may already exist, privacy is still being entrenched, and the capacity of human rights organizations to educate and advocate is still growing. But in the meantime, governments are spying on their citizens, corporations are buying and selling personal data, and individuals are consistently losing the tug-of-war. It is clear that the challenges of data protection continue to manifest themselves in developing countries despite the current mechanisms of alleviating them. Technology will continue advancing, and this is why governments of developing countries need to review existing laws on data protection to suit new technologies. Similarly, enforcement procedures need to be reviewed. Law enforcement agents need to be trained on dealing with more sophisticated data crimes. Computer ethics education and training needs to be intensified by reviewing existing curricula and organizing refresher courses for practicing computing professionals. Service providers in computing businesses should be trained on how to deal with unethical customers. Regulatory bodies should be established to censor for service providers. Our recommendation to developing countries is that they should strengthen the current legislation and enforcement procedures on data protection. They should emphasize ethics education for all computing professionals and organize in-service courses for practicing computing professionals. All these will eliminate the challenges and make the culture of data access and data protection ethical in developing countries. Developing countries need to adopt and enforce privacy and data protection laws as they attempt to bridge the digital divide, widened by the advent of new technologies like cloud computing. The Information Economy Report 2013, by the UNCTAD, UN Trade and Development Body, warns that the global shift towards cloud computing, which allows users to store and access data remotely, brings a range of legal as well as technological and infrastructure challenges for poor countries. Cloud computing has the potential to offer users in developing countries access to unprecedented resources of computing power and storage, says the report, noting how cloud services can help cut costs on hardware and software, provide greater flexibility and mobility, and enable worldwide collaboration. However, it warns that as services offered via the internet become more complex, unreliable, and expensive, broadband access in many developing countries, together with power outages and a lack of IT skills, risk widening the digital divide. With all the potential that cloud computing holds, it also poses some serious risks to the protection of a user's personal information. This is especially true in developing countries where an absence of strong data protection and privacy laws, coupled with weak accountability mechanisms, means that information stored in the cloud is vulnerable to a variety of threats, from hacking to corporate exploitation to a snooping government. We've had the tendency to look at the digital divide in terms of whether you have access or not to technologies, and so some think The digital divide is closing because more people have access to mobile phones. But it's important not only to have access, but to have quality access, quoted from the report. During an average minute in 2012, Google received around 2 million search requests. Facebook users shared around 700,000 content items, and Twitter sent out 200,000 tweets, notes the report. However, an estimated 60% of such cloud traffic came from Europe and North America, followed by the Asia-Pacific region. Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa together accounted for only 5%. Broadband prices remain high in many poor countries, while in 2011, the average monthly price for fixed broadband was estimated at less than 2% of per capita income in developed countries. In developing countries, that figure was 40%. The cost of mobile broadband in poor countries is between 20 and 30% of per capita income. Data security and privacy concerns, which have intensified worldwide following the revelations in 2013 about NSA national surveillance programs and reports on access by law enforcement agencies to data hosted by cloud service providers, are among the most important issues facing developing countries. Some cloud applications, particularly consumer-focused services like webmail, are already being used in many developing countries despite the lack of data protection laws. As of 2013, as I already said in my introduction, and I'll skip that one. So, the NSA revelations have caused people worldwide to doubt the wisdom of entrusting their data to cloud services operated, for example, by American companies, and some US firms have said they risk losing billions of dollars as customers become increasingly wary of using their services. The debate that has been sparked is very useful in that governments and other users are forced to think through the implications of uploading data to the cloud. This does not only relate to developed countries, but to developing countries, as said in the report. The UN recently adopted a resolution drafted by Germany and Brazil, reaffirming the human right to privacy in the digital age. Also, a panel is scheduled on that topic. The resolution was also sponsored by developing countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Indonesia, Peru, and Uruguay. The AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection was adopted in June 2014 to bind all member states of the African Union to abide to data protection principles and to provide for the setting up of independent data protection authorities. These developments will considerably affect the developing world privacy landscape in a positive way. The AU Convention is in consonance with international principles and now should embark upon a serious campaign of educating the members to convince them to adhere to it. The EU data protection reform should also see light. Thank you very much. Yes.
Mon exposé portera sur la protection des données personnelles et de la vie privée en Afrique. Et il sera scindé en deux grandes parties. L'intérêt de la protection des données personnelles et de la vie privée en Afrique, et l'approche en grand de l'approche pour une protection efficace des données personnelles et de la vie privée en Afrique. En introduction, les technologies de l'information et de la communication sont de plus en plus au cœur du développement de nos sociétés. En effet, qu'elles soient émergentes ou non, les technologies de l'information et de la communication font partie de leur politique et stratégie de développement. l'on ne peut plus parler de développement sans prendre en compte la dimension humaine, précisément les droits et libertés fondamentaux de l'homme. La protection de ces droits et libertés, notamment celle des données personnelles et de la vie privée, constitue une préoccupation majeure des États inscrits dans une dynamique démocratique. Il en va ainsi pour bon nombre de pays africains